Before we get started with this week's episode, I want to call out the Academy's celebration of the American Public Servant 250th Gala, coming this Monday, June 22nd, at the Library of Congress. This gala is a centerpiece in our participation in the America 250 celebration. And I hope if you're listening and you're in the Washington, D.C. area, that you're planning to join us for this event. It's going to be a great night with some great speakers, and it's an opportunity to get together and honor some amazing public servants. To learn more about it, visit www.napawash.org/caps. Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. Today, we'll talk about one of the most important but often overlooked drivers of government performance, human resources systems. From federal hiring to state civil service reforms to local workforce challenges, HR policies shape how governments recruit, retain, and empower the people who deliver public services. Joining me today are two experts on public sector workforce reform. Gabe Menchaca, Senior Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center, and Academy Fellow Steve Krauss, a leader in public administration and workforce policy. Together, we'll explore what's working, what's not, and what government across all levels can learn from each other. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Gabe, let's start with you. The Niskanen Center, in partnership with the Academy, recently completed a study. We looked at state HR systems across the country, and we found a number of interesting things. Can you tell us what stood out to you and where those impactful insights came from?
Absolutely. And thank you first, James-Christian, for having me. And I should say, we've worked together for a long time, and Steve and I have worked together for a long time. But for some of your listeners, this may be the first time they're encountering Niskanen or our work. And just to give a quick beat, we're a domestic policy think tank. One of the things that we do is state capacity, and I lead our work on the civil service. But we do a lot of other things too, and that actually makes us a little bit unique in the management reform ecosystem. Because unlike many of my colleagues, and I used to work at the Partnership for Public Service, as did you, and others work at sort of federally focused kind of management good government groups. But I work at a think tank that covers immigration and healthcare and housing and transportation and all of the things. It's the broader abundance agenda. And I approach my work in the context of all of those policy areas. And so the reason that we went to go do this study with the Academy late last year and early this year is that there's a real gap in the literature, right? When I got out of government and came to start doing my work here last February, I was really struck by how little scholarship there was about what states do, right? For all the rhetoric about laboratories of democracy and the fact that there's 50 of them that do substantially similar things, there really isn't a huge amount of descriptive or analytic scholarship and research about what works or what even they do, right? And so the study we did at the Academy was an opportunity to fill that gap by actually explaining at a basic level, like, what do state civil service systems look like? So there are a few things that came out of that. And I should say the work was primarily designed to be descriptive. And we did not attempt to say, sort of what's better or worse necessarily, but there are some themes that came out. So I think the number one theme that jumped out to me over the course of this work is that there's really no single best model, and there isn't even really convergence on a model, right? So if you think about it, they say that some games like Connect 4 or checkers or whatever are solved, right? You can sort of know mathematically what the right answer is. Public sector HR is not solved in any sense, particularly at the state level, right? So a whole bunch of states have centralized HR. Some are partially or fully decentralized. Texas doesn't even have a central personnel agency. Vermont and Utah, for example, are highly centralized, and states are somewhere in between. An interesting thing that we saw through that research, though, is that there's actually no rhyme or reason sometimes to why a state is one way, right? Or at least there isn't intuitive reasoning based on the characteristics of the state, right? Like I mentioned, Vermont and Utah, highly centralized, very different states, right? The economies are different, the labor markets are different, the politics are different, the history is different, right? And yet there's a convergence there. A couple other things that stood out to me that I think are interesting. One universal we did see is convergence around skills-based hiring. And by the way, we'll probably talk about this a little bit. We see that also happening in the federal government, but that the results are really mixed right now. And so states have done things like remove degree requirements and try to move towards skills assessment. But this is really hard, right? And we see this reflected in the federal government's push in many of the same ways. And the fact is, a lot of states have bottlenecks around getting assessments in place and actually measuring whether things are changing, right? Because if you remove degree requirements and just substitute 4 years of relevant experience, like you actually haven't opened public service to anyone new. States in general are undertaking these transformations, but don't really have a good theory of the case about how to measure whether something's working or not working, or improving time to hire or not improving time to hire. They even measure and define those metrics differently across states. And so comparative analysis is really hard.
So, Steve, Gabe just shared a number of things, but let's go back. Gabe said there's a lack of scholarship and research when it comes to states. Do you agree with that assertion? And how do you characterize state civil service systems for yourself and the work that you've been doing?
To kind of zoom out here for a moment, Gabe provided a whole litany of challenges that exist in the HR policy space. And I think you see this as well with the federal government, right? Which is there are plenty of challenges, wherever you look, it's kind of hard to know where to even start. But, when you take a look at HR and what HR really means in a governmental sense, whether it's at the state and local level or at the federal level, realize that governments aren't manufacturing companies, right? They're service providers. There's a great tie-in between the human resources of a government and the services that it provides. It really is the human resources that provides the value from a governmental perspective. So in a lot of respects, the biggest issue that I think governments face, whether it's federal, state, or local, is really in sort of the resource planning and allocation of those resources, which you might think of as strategic workforce planning. And, I look at the things that Gabe was talking about, and I think you can kind of tie a through line between those. The variety and the variability that you see across states, just sort of adds to this idea that it's challenging to figure out. As Gabe said, it's not a solved problem. It's not even really solved from the perspective of creating a mathematical model and trying to figure out exactly where those resources need to be allocated. More so, even when you look at the federal level, given what federal agencies and the federal workforce in particular have been through over the last 18 months or so, this challenge of how do you ensure that you have the right people with the right skills in the right jobs and in the right quantities is just a tremendous challenge, I think, at every level of government. I mean, that's a big challenge even in the best of times. And in a lot of respects, it's an all-encompassing challenge that incorporates all these other things that we're talking about, from performance management, how you hire, how you fire, how you pay people, and even the kinds of changes that are going on in terms of the way that we want to manage the workforce, like the move to skills-based hiring and skills-based workforce management. So these are big challenges even in the best of times. But then on the federal level in particular, the way in which a lot of these changes were executed in the last year has left the workforce, frankly, in disarray in a number of places and a number of ways. And while federal employees are covering the gaps and patching holes heroically, in my opinion, if you peel back the patches and the bandages, you find some real challenges just in terms of understanding what the composition of the workforce is and what it should be in a variety of places. I think, to just reflect on what Gabe was talking about at the state and local level, where you've got, even more variability in systems and capability and capacity to do that kind of work and planning, I think you just sort of multiply those challenges.
Yeah, you're talking about a lot of different hiring authorities and ways to approaching hiring. Both of you talked about skilled-based hiring, but let's move in a different direction and let's talk about merit-based hiring. This is something that in the first time in recent history, public administration and federal HR have dominated news cycles. People are talking about hiring. There's this idea about whether it's based on political affiliation and alignment or whether it's based on expertise and merit. How does this affect the federal workforce? And can you help us understand the differences? And if there are differences at the state level or the federal level? Gabe, maybe we start with you, and then Steve, you should certainly chime in as well.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think skills-based hiring and merit-based hiring, you can really think of those as the same thing, right? In the federal government, we haven't had a system that is principally focused on sorting people by merit in quite a long time. We've had a nonpartisan system, right, But I want to distinguish that a little bit from one that's trying to actually sort out via competition who the best person for a role is, right? At the sort of beginning of the nonpartisan civil service in the 1800s, right? It really actually starts in the 1850s. I know a lot of people start with the Pendleton Act, but there was sort of a movement to do, assessments related to the job starting in the 1850s. And then through much of the 20th century, the idea was that competition was the foundation of merit and that you should compete based on your skills, based on an assessment of your suitability for the specific jobs, right? And actually, you go over to the National Archives and pull, archival copies of skills assessments from the 19th century and actually look at like the attention they paid to designing systems that accurately tested for things relevant to the job, right? There's a line that I think is perhaps attributable to Theodore Roosevelt, but certainly was attributable to a discussion they had in the Civil Service Commission at the time, wondering aloud, for instance, whether they might test marksmanship for being the postmaster in like territorial Arizona, right? Because they figure, you're going to have to defend yourself against bandits or whatever, right? Somewhere along the way in the 20th century, and I actually have a paper on this that we did last year in light of the Chance to Compete Act, it got too expensive and complicated to start testing jobs that themselves had become more complicated, right? So like when Steve and I worked together when we were in government, we were looking at like, how do you manage the portfolio of HRIT? If I had to come up with a test for Steve's job that he did managing the HR QSPO, it'd be really hard to do, right? Because there's a lot of things that go into that, right? It's not doing the little weights at a customs house, right? Stakeholder management, it's domain expertise, and so on and so forth. And so instead we had like kind of proxies for management, right? Or proxies for merit rather. So things like resume reviews, right? Self-attestation in USA Jobs, right? The little radio button stuff that people hate. But those really aren't based on merit at all, right? They're based on a desire to be nonpartisan and objective, but not necessarily test people. And so when you think about skills-based hiring, and this applies at the states and at the federal level, it's really the move to recenter competition and objective measurement of skills rather than your biography in the hiring process for public service jobs. So thinking about decomposing jobs into competencies, for example, and testing those individual competencies, right? Because like I don't need to test someone on the HR QSMO director exam, but I could test someone on their ability to manage stakeholders, their ability to engage with vendors, their understanding of the broader federal procurement and management ecosystem, right? And, I might be able to mix and match assessments that I could use for Steve, but I also might use for other people as a way of kind of bringing that cost down and actually making it feasible for agencies to do it. I should note that this has really been a bipartisan effort over the last handful of years. The Chance to Compete Act most recently made a lot of progress in requiring agencies to move in this direction. And that was signed by President Biden during the lame duck after passing both houses, on a bipartisan basis, and is now being implemented by OPM and is in many ways the foundation of some of their work on merit hiring, which I think is good and we should celebrate.
Steve, now seems like a really good time to think about how you can do HR management and hiring differently. Arguably, the current administration is certainly taking that view. You just heard some challenges that Gabe outlined at the federal and state level. How do you think about reimagining HR hiring, HR management?
So first of all, I love listening to Gabe giving that history lesson and talking about the through line all the way back to the 1850s. It certainly highlights the fact that a lot of these concepts that we're talking about are really not that new in principle. In fact, a lot of this is really sort of getting back to basics and getting back to sort of the nuts and bolts of how we think about this stuff. And I will say, I'm glad that I didn't need to be tested on my marksmanship skills for my job at OPM. Don't know how good I would have done at that. But as Gabe pointed out, getting back to the basics when we talk about skills-based hiring and how we're testing people and assessing people for the skills they need to do their jobs, that's really a pretty common sense proposal. And to kind of go back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago with regards to strategic workforce planning, I want to tie this back because it's also not just about the hiring process. It's not just about skills-based hiring. It's really about skills-based workforce management. If you really stop and think about how do we think about what people we need where in a workforce, you have to start with some kind of rational, finite job architecture, something that defines the set of jobs that need to be done, which, by the way, has been a challenge in and of itself as the government has sort of proliferated and promulgated, various position descriptions and classifications and things of that nature. And then once you have that job architecture, you can think about it in terms of what skills do you need to do a particular job at a particular level. And you'll hear terms in the profession like a skills ontology or a skills framework. It's really sort of a scaffolding that you can lay over that job architecture. And then from there, you can start to do kind of a fit gap analysis. Who do we have in the workforce today? Do they have the right skills to do the jobs that need to be done or not, and things of that nature? And the reason that I point all this out is because I think that's fundamentally where we're heading in the federal government. It is very closely aligned to what's going on in commercial industry. So it's really not different or unique from that standpoint. And as well, a lot of the commercial tools, applications, and platforms that are out there, the IT that's available to help us automate and streamline, these HR processes, these are now designed to actually do the kinds of things that we're talking about in terms of job architecture, skills ontology, and then how you map that into a strategic workforce plan. And so when you put it all together, this merit hiring plan, which OPM introduced now about a year ago, and it's got a lot of things in the plan, and some of those things ended up being a little controversial because they kind of struck a political nerve, but a lot of it was really sort of this nuts and bolts, kind of getting back to common sense. It included things like a focus on recruiting for early career talent and for STEM and for veterans, standardizing position descriptions and making better use of talent pools and shared certificates, to be able to better match candidates with jobs that might be available across a range of agencies. The whole move towards skills-based hiring and this increased use of technical or alternative assessments, the things that Gabe was talking about that were part of the Chance to Compete Act and part of an executive order in the first Trump administration as well. And then a rededication to streamlining the job application process and reducing time to hire. All of this is a lot of that is very non-controversial and really sort of common sense.
Steve, I'd be remiss if I didn't pick on a thread that you just laid out, which is really that upstream of all of the stuff we've been talking about is that job architecture and our classification system. I actually released a gigantic comprehensive study of the past, present, and future of the general schedule that's available right now on the Niskanen Center's website, because I think that you're exactly right. And actually that rethinking all of the things that we're doing, right? Skills-based hiring, streamlining the application process, all of this stuff is basically marginalia if we don't get the actual structure of federal jobs right in the first place, right? And so if you think about the last 30 or 40 years, trying things like pooled hiring, alternative assessments, exotic accountability schemes, or whatever, they never seem to have much of an impact. And I would argue, and I argue in the paper, that the reason none of that changes and none of that works is that we haven't got the job architecture right. And, we have a tremendously task-defined system today, and that's about to melt with white-collar automation, right? And so really finding ways to move to a skills, competencies, and above all else, outcome-based classification system, I think is really the key to pulling a lot of this stuff off.
So Gabe, one of the things that you're pointing out that I think is also worth highlighting here is the interfaces that exist between sort of policy, regulation, and the philosophy or the paradigm on the one side, and then the actual mechanics of how this stuff gets done, to include, by the way, the systems and the IT that exists at the agency level and across the federal government. And James-Christian, you had mentioned early on that in this administration, recently, public administration and federal HR have dominated the news cycles. I think part of the reason that was the case was because this administration's initial thrust to move fast and break things was so jarring. But one of the things that it really did highlight, and I think did have at least one positive effect, in my opinion, was that it highlighted the need to modernize a variety of aspects of HR policy, operations, and the underlying IT. And I give OPM, OMB, and the administration a lot of credit for maintaining its focus on this and following through. And I think you see a lot of examples in what is going on and the reason why this is continuing to drive these news cycles, from OPM's ability to get the online retirement application over the finish line, get that implemented on the retirement side. Their recent announcement about the USA class offering, which kind of goes to, Gabe, what you were talking about in terms of trying to improve the classification and position description process. Obviously, there's this large program that's ongoing right now with HR 2.0 and the modernization of the core HCM system. And there's also a modernization that's coming down the pike with USA Hire, because they're foreseeing a large expansion in the need for hiring assessments, as we were just talking about. All of that requires a fair amount of investment, quite frankly, and that's going to tie back to OMB from the budgeting side. It ties back to political leadership, not only at OPM and OMB, but across the agencies. And it's gonna require money. So it goes back to the budget and the overall policies of the administration. So I hope they're able to maintain that focus and continue to follow through, because I think it's promising thus far.
Gabe, you just heard Steve really credit current leaders in the administration for modernizing policy, operations, and IT. There's a lot of gains to be made right now. Are there also lessons to be learned, perhaps from states or prior administrations and how they've tried to modernize efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the number one biggest thing when I talk to policymakers at the state level or at the federal level and folks on the Hill that I try to emphasize for them is that this is a place where cooler heads have got to prevail. And when you think about the history of workforce reform in the United States, it's only happened durably as a result of bipartisan compromise, right? When you think about going it alone as an executive branch, it really never works, right? Just to be really honest. If you think about what happened in the 1990s with Clinton's reinventing government and all that, and I have a kind of piece on our website where I kind of step through the puts and takes of that story, I think the ultimate choice to go after, for example, headcount or administrative reform in advance of more comprehensive statutory reform to the underlying structure of the civil service, Congress never got there, right? And so the lasting impact was really to reduce headcount and sort of reshape the federal workforce, but not actually make it any more capacious, right? We saw this also in the Bush administration with NSPS and MaxHR and DHS, right? Passing those on party line bases in the wake of 9/11 was a mistake, right? Because they weren't durable. People who deserved a seat at the table, right? Frankly, an entire sort of half of Congress and the constituencies they represent felt like they didn't get a chance to weigh in. And so, of course, because nothing lasts forever, when the House and Senate flipped and eventually the White House, those got unwound, right? And so I emphasize this back to people all the time because when you kind of do thin partisan heuristics in this space, it never seems to work, right? I would point out, for example, the Louisiana voters rejected a ballot initiative to unwind their civil service commission, right? In the context of some partisan messaging about the Doge of Louisiana being enabled by this. They rejected it 70-30 or something like that. And proceeding with these sort of narrow, partisanly veiled reform efforts just doesn't work, right? And so you think about OPM's merit hiring, plan that Steve mentioned, there's a lot of good stuff in there, right? If I could give one piece of advice to everyone, it's leave the culture war stuff at home, right? And that's true, I think, whether you're a state, whether you're a locality, whether you're the federal government, and really, frankly, whether you're a company or a private employer too, right? We all have these struggles. But this is a hard enough problem on its own to solve without needlessly politicizing the topic, right? So anyway, that's I think if you look at the history, the things that Congress says in statute tend to stay in statute for a long time, or they never make it there at all, right? And the only way that that's going to happen is being clear and confident for all of us in the reform community about the way we have to approach this, which is that if it's passed on a party line vote or via EO, it's not durable and it's unlikely to work.
Gabe, I agree. Sidestepping the culture war, leaving the really partisan politics out of it is a useful thing. And in particular, if you want to achieve long-term reform, a bipartisan approach, the executive branch and legislative branch must cooperate. And importantly, things should really be in legislation to have long-standing. But there's a point to be made that some of the reform that we're seeing happening right now, Steve, jarring or not, really would have only been able to advance with this somewhat radical approach, or at least really asking the tough questions and really pushing some of the boundaries. Do you think there's space to continue down that path, or is now the right time to kind of think we've got a lot of attention, we've got a lot of the key players interested in true reform? Now is the time to really look at bipartisan, cooperative, long-standing ways of doing civil service reform?
Yeah, I think the answer is probably a little bit of both. I think there is clearly an opportunity to strike while the iron's hot here. We've got a level of executive sponsorship around HR, both from the policy side and from the IT and the modernization side, that I don't think we've seen in at least 20 years. I would say that, and this kind of gets to some of the points Gabe was making about cooler heads prevailing, and let's take a breath and kind of think about where we really have differences and where we really have similarities of opinion. Because I think there's a lot of things that people agree about in terms of deficiencies in everything ranging from the performance management process, how we hold people accountable, to the hiring process and the degree to which we need to put more guardrails in place versus take guardrails off to be able to streamline that process. And oftentimes the answer to some of these trade-offs is not really so much of an or, it's really sort of an and some of it has to do with empowering the people who are in the roles, hiring managers and current HR departments, and trusting them to get the job done and to do the right thing. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here.
Steve, I agree with you, but I just to pull that thread a little bit, I do want to point out that I think absent a fundamental kind of rethinking of the statutory basis for the civil service, I'm not sure that we can really change the look and feel of government employment, right? Just at the end of the day. And I think there's been sort of a tendency over the last 20 or 30 years to try and outmanage the bad statute. I did a piece on this last year where I think like the sort of managerial turn for in kind of government administration, right? I say this as like a former management consultant, like a government run by management consultants has not been very good for policymaking because there's a tendency to believe that like you can actually, outmanage and sort of outfox the bad statute. And then when you look back at the story there, I'm like not sure things have really changed as a result of that. And so it's certainly my view that absent a large-scale effort to really rethink from sort of first principles, the statutory basis of the civil service, I'm not sure that we can get beyond kind of little incremental tweaks to really kind of change the government and kind of purpose fit it for the 21st century.
I kind of liken this to a baseball analogy. I'd like to see things like HR IT modernization and some of the things that OPM is working on right now be akin to hitting some base hits, maybe load those bases so you can hit that home run, make it a grand slam when you're able to actually get Congress to do the things that you're talking about. But I think beyond just, it being sort of a catchy analogy, I think there's also this question in people's minds about whether government can actually get, basic things accomplished and make good on some of the things that we're meant to do before being entrusted with doing bigger things. So I think it's incumbent on the government to do both.
That's a great place to leave it. We've got a lot of lessons learned, a lot of opportunity when we think about federal hiring as well as federal workforce management. There are things that come from the states that can be best practices, but there's also things that the states could learn from some of the things that are happening at the federal level. I think you two said it best that there needs to be bipartisan cooperation. There needs to be work on the executive branch side and certainly on the legislative branch side as well. Thank you both for joining Gabe and Steve. This has been an interesting and informative conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Likewise.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.